Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and on this edition of L'Chaim, I have the pleasure of welcoming once again David Dalin, who's written a fascinating history of the Jewish men and women who've had an inestimable impact on American life and on the nature of American democracy. David's book is entitled Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court. It tells the story of the 8 Jews who've been members of the court, from Louis Brandeis, the first Jew to be appointed to the Supreme Court, to today's court as we sit at our L'Chaim table, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. David Dalin, a conservative rabbi with both a master's degree and a PhD from Brandeis, has taught Jewish studies at several universities, including the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the Conservative Movement's Rabbinical School, where David received his smicha, and George Washington University. And David has written extensively on many aspects of American Jewish history and politics, and on Christian-Jewish relations, including a book entitled The Myth of Hitler's Pope, How Pope Pius XII Rescued Jews from the Nazis. David, welcome back to L'Chaim. Thank you for joining us again.
It's good to be back, Mark.
Come to Arthur Goldberg.
Some wonderful stories. Okay.
And Arthur Goldberg, by the way, now it comes closer to today.
Yes.
Many, many viewers of L'Chaim remember Arthur Goldberg. He was, he was part of the administration.
Sure.
He was part of the civil rights movement. And in many ways, he represented a golden era.
He did.
So talk about Arthur Goldberg.
Well, Arthur Goldberg grew up in Chicago. And I should say, just like Frankfurter and Fortas, he was the first in his family to go to college. Graduates at the top of his class at Northwestern University Law School, and cannot get a job in any of the blue chip law firms.
Because he's
Jewish. Now, and it's interesting, Adlai Stevenson, who's later connected with Goldberg, graduates in the amorphous middle of Northwestern 3 years earlier. He gets offers from every firm because he's part of the patrician elite of Chicago. Goldberg joins a small firm. The 2 partners' names were Pritzker. Now, this is the Pritzker family who then bought and now own the Hyatt hotel chain. Penny Pritzker was in the Obama administration, and they've become one of the wealthiest Jewish families in the United States. But then they were just starting out, the 2 brothers, and he worked there for a brief time and got an interest in labor law. He then branches out on his own and becomes known as the preeminent labor lawyer in America. And the preeminent labor negotiator. He negotiates the merger of the AFL and CIO, for example. And he's John F. Kennedy's labor advisor when Kennedy is in the Senate. And he's also becomes the first labor lawyer ever appointed to the Supreme Court. So it's natural when Kennedy is elected, he appoints Goldberg as Secretary of Labor. And Kennedy once said that Goldberg was the smartest person in his cabinet, which is
your book says.
Yeah.
Kennedy says he's the smartest man I ever knew.
Oh, did I? Yeah, actually, I think it should be one of the 2 smartest men I ever knew. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Goldberg was, incredibly brilliant. The same story about him as was about Brandeis at Harvard, that he had the highest scholastic average in Northwestern's. It almost becomes apocryphal because they said the same thing about Fortas at Yale Law School. But but he's very bright. Not, how do I say this? Not known for his humility, which creates a problem later on when he's set to leave the court. He has the shortest tenure of any of the justices, but I want to go
for a good reason.
For a good reason,
a positive reason, not a negative reason.
Exactly, and I want to come back to that in front. But let me just talk because it's very interesting about his Jewishness, and that's he grows up as he and his wife were active in the Zionist movement. One of their close friends from Milwaukee is Golda Meir, later becomes Golda Meir. He's he's a lifelong member of a Reform synagogue who does go to services regularly. And two interesting things about this relate to anecdotes also. But he's the first Jewish justice, none of the others before, to have a Pesach Seder. And in Washington, his Seders are the events of the season. They, and everyone, senators, I found it as papers, RSVPs from, Hubert Humphrey and his wife, from Ted Kennedy and his wife, even from President Kennedy and his wife. But they're attended by everyone, including George Meany, the labor leader who regales the Seder with his Irish folk songs. His wife, Dorothy, regales it with Yiddish songs. And, but it's a who's who to get an invitation for it. And now the story is that I know you know, of course, Alan Dershowitz quite well, and Alan was kind enough, I'm very grateful to him, he gave me a photo of him and Justice Goldberg that's in my book. Now, he tells the story both in his recent memoir and in his wonderful book, Chutzpah, about that the Seder, when Alan Dershowitz was his law clerk, Goldberg didn't observe kashrut. But when there were going to be people who did at a Seder, he would get the best-known kosher caterer in Washington to cater the Seder. And that happened to be one of the years when Alan Dershowitz was his law clerk. And among other things he did then, he, on his Supreme Court letterhead, stationery, I have a photo of this, he sent to the kosher caterer the Goldberg family recipe for charosis, which is wonderful. And he had his old Goldberg family Haggadah, which, Brandeis certainly didn't have, Frankfurter didn't have, not even Cardozo. And it was really a tremendous event. And that's one of, he was also very close to Israel. The other story I must tell you, which is just delightful, when he's still in President Kennedy's cabinet, before he's on the court, he's told the story often. He went to visit his elderly mother in Chicago. And his mother had become very active in Jewish organizations. So one day Goldberg is sleeping late, and the phone rings. And his mother answers the phone, but Goldberg is awake enough to hear. And the voice it's President Kennedy. And so his mother asks, who is this? And he says, oh, this is the president. And she says, no? What, president of what shul? But it's a wonderful story. No, Goldberg then is appointed to the court, which for him is a lifelong dream. And Goldberg, by the way, is probably the most genuinely Jewish in terms of he knows Yiddish. He goes to synagogue, etc.
Yes. By the way, you mentioned that Alan Dershowitz was his law clerk.
One of his, yeah.
And who preceded him?
Steve Breyer.
So he's the only justice. Yeah. Two clerks of that name. But he is a clerk who becomes Supreme Court justice. That's not unique.
Yeah.
But to have Breyer and Dershowitz is quite something.
It's quite something. It really is. As you do, I admire Alan Dershowitz so much, and it's to have had clerks of that caliber one after another. Now, of course, Breyer is the first Jewish justice to have been a law clerk to her.
Yes, but Alan Dershowitz becomes the Felix Frankfurter
professor of law
at Harvard.
At Harvard Law School.
There's a whole. It's all in.
Yeah.
It all comes back.
It all comes back. It goes. What goes around comes. Yeah. He does. And he also, by the way, I should say one thing about law clerks, and this is fascinating. Felix Frankfurter, who in 1959, a professor at Harvard Law School who used to recommend law clerks for Felix Frankfurter, Albert Sachs, who later became the first Jewish dean of Harvard Law School, recommends one of his star pupils, a young woman by the name of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And he tells her, he raves, she's one of the greatest students we've had. By the way, when she entered Harvard Law School in 1956, she was one of only 9 women in a class of over 500. Frankfurter refuses even to interview her. And he says, I just can't do this. I would not be comfortable having a woman as a law clerk, which is just so incredible.
It's a different world.
It's a different world.
Yes.
And he was set in his ways, and he was already close to 80. It was a completely different world.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, tell me about Goldberg and the law.
Okay, Goldberg and the law is it's one of the great tragedies that that he resigned from the court when he did.
Well, he resigned to become?
To become ambassador to the United Nations.
Yes.
Now can I tell that story?
Yes.
You have time? Okay. The story really was LBJ wanted to appoint his close friend and advisor, Abe Fortas, to the court. Now, 1948, a young congressman, New Deal congressman, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is running the election of his life for the Senate in Texas. If he had lost that election, we never would have heard of LBJ. That election, there was a lot of voter fraud, more than even in recent years. With more than 500,000 votes cast, LBJ was ahead at first by less than 100 votes. So they get a blue ribbon commission of prominent Washington attorneys to decide on the case. Abe Fortas chairs this. He argues the case for LBJ at the Supreme Court. LBJ is declared the winner by 87 votes out of 1,500,060 votes. Now, there's no question, all the biographers, there was monumental voter fraud there, and he should have lost the election. Well, LBJ never forgot that. Abe Fortas, who becomes one of the most prominent Washington attorneys, is LBJ's personal attorney. He becomes his closest advisor when he's when he's in the Senate, and later vice president and president. So LBJ always wants to reward him by appointing him to the court. Fortas, though, never wanted to go on the court. Fortas and his wife were used to a luxurious lifestyle. They had twin Rolls Royces. His wife, by the way, had in one closet alone 150 pairs of shoes. She was really kind of a piece of work, as I talk about in my book. He would have had to take, which he did, a 90% salary cut to go on the court. He refused. Johnson offered him the position of Attorney General. He turned that down. He maneuvered a situation in which Goldberg was one of the great negotiators in the country. Goldberg was a strong opponent of the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson basically implied to him, which he did the opposite, that if he were ambassador to the United Nations, he would be able to try to negotiate an honorable end to the Vietnam War. Now, first of all, that's not done by the UN ambassador anyway. It's usually the State Department. But so he persuades and pressures. People say that if Lyndon Johnson pressured you, you could not resist it. Against Goldberg's best inclination, his parents begged him. His wife and family begged him not to resign from the court. It made no sense. The Supreme Court appointment is a lifetime appointment. The UN ambassadorship is at the pleasure of the president, who, by the way, decides not to run for re-election in 1968. Goldberg died in 1991, I guess, or 90 or 91. He was in good health until the last year of his. He would have been one of the great figures of the war in court.
It's a tragedy.
It's a tragedy. In fact, when I was thinking of having more different titles rather than just the names of things, I was going to title this "The Tragedy of Arthur Goldberg." It was an immense tragedy. He goes on. He leaves the court, and basically LBJ ruins two political careers. Goldberg's, and if we have time, I'll talk about Fortas. But against the advice of anyone, he goes to the UN. It's very good during the Six-Day War because he's tremendously pro-Israel and a very articulate, outspoken voice for Israel. But when it comes to Vietnam policy, he's frozen out. Johnson doesn't let him do a thing. In fact, ironically, Fortas, while on the court, becomes, which was as unkosher as you can be, becomes one of, and was a hawk, advised Johnson on Vietnam policy. He finally has a falling out with Johnson. And also, Johnson dangled before Goldberg two possibilities if he would leave the court. One, that when Earl Warren retired, he would nominate him as Chief Justice. And the other is he might even consider nominating as vice president. Okay. He has a falling out, Goldberg has a falling out, who is a very honorable man, with Johnson over Vietnam. So much so that he's basically, He resigns from the court, but after he no longer is on speaking terms with
And that
Johnson.
basically ends his political career.
It ends his public career with one even more drastic tragedy, but it ends his public career.
What's the other tragedy?
Well, he first goes to law practice in the big Paul Weiss Rifkin, one of the big Jewish law firms. In 1970, he runs for governor of New York against Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller was the quintessential backslapping politician. Goldberg was very formal. He insisted, even while campaigning for governor, on being addressed as Justice Goldberg. As Alan Dershowitz recounts in his memoir, or one of his memoirs, Goldberg didn't even know New York. He made some mistake talking about where Coney Island was. He was so out of place, and he wasn't a politician. And he was formal, whereas he lost by over 700,000
He got killed.
He got killed. It
Yeah.
was a landslide.
Yeah.
By the way, speaking of landslides, when I said that thing about Fortas, enabling Lyndon Johnson to win that election, after that, Johnson was always called jokingly Landslide Lyndon. But sadly, tragically, I think it is a tragedy for someone who was had such... Goldberg.
Yeah, it was a tragedy.
He ends his career by losing by between 700 and 800,000 votes. He then retires, so to speak. He still practiced law back to Washington. But it was such a distinguished, in one decade, by the way, he was the only of the Jewish justices who was a cabinet member before. He's a member of Kennedy's cabinet, one of the best. He had a Supreme Court career that could have been one of the greatest in history.
America lost.
America lost.
Let me ask you, he was part of the Warren Court.
He was part of the Warren Court.
And we haven't talked about that at all, and you should talk a moment about it, because the Warren Court, first of all, many of us grew up with the Warren Court.
Yeah.
The Warren Court was the quintessential activist court.
Yes.
That was Warren's philosophy.
Right.
And of course, it was critical in the civil rights movement. And Goldberg's a part of the Warren Court.
Yeah.
And if there is some kind of overlap or some kind of relevance to Goldberg being part of the Warren Court, talk about that for a moment.
One of his great, and it was also a tragedy that he didn't get to do it, one of his great passions and goals was to decide that constitutionally the death penalty was unconstitutional. In fact, that's when Alan Dershowitz was his law clerk. In fact, they later write a famous article in the Harvard Law Review in 1970 when Goldberg was off the court about the effort to rule the death penalty unconstitutional. That was one of his great goals. He didn't succeed. And later, only in the 70s, the death penalty starts to, in decision after decision, fulfill what Goldberg wanted to do. But he's one of the great civil libertarians on the court. And what is I'm trying to think the one case, when it comes to the rights of, before the Miranda decision.
Escobedo.
That, you have to be informed before that you have the right to counsel.
Yes.
And if you don't have, and it's the famous, it's in two decisions, one after, but that you have to be informed in any kind of police interrogation. Any suspect in a criminal decision has to be informed that they have the right to counsel. If they are not so informed, the case can be thrown out of court.
And Goldberg was a champion of that concept.
Yes, he was a champion of that concept.
Yes.
And he was a great civil libertarian. He was a champion. That concept is later fulfilled more after he's off the court. But but he's a champion of that. And when it came to the rights of criminal defendants, that was one of his great contributions.
Yes. Well, you've talked a moment already about Abe Fortas. I have to tell you, from my own, as I lived through the period, the justice who had the least impact on me, who seemed almost irrelevant. No justice is irrelevant, but for me, Abe Fortas came and went.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
No.
Am I missing something?
No, you're not. Actually, technically, he was on the court a few months longer than Goldberg was. He gets on the court. By the way, I should tell you, even before Goldberg had told Johnson definitely that he was going to resign, Johnson invites Fortas to the Oval Office, and he says, we're going to walk to the Rose Garden because there's some announcements I want to make. Walk with me. On the way there, he tells him that he's nominating him to the court. Fortas had sent him 2 previous letters saying, absolutely, I will not accept such an appointment. He has the chutzpah. He announces this, and mind you, chronologically, Goldberg hadn't even officially sent in his letter of resignation. So he makes this announcement. Fortas's wife hears this on the phone. She calls the White House, and she berates Lyndon Johnson. And someone in the White House, on the White House staff, said they had never heard anyone ever talk to Lyndon Johnson that way. She says, I thought we were friends. They used to socialize together. How can you do that to us? You are no longer welcome in our home. We're no longer your friends. And she hangs up on him. His wife, they didn't have children. In fact, well, this is a sideline, but it's in there. His wife didn't want to have children. He very much did. They had this tremendous lifestyle in which she desperately wanted to keep up. He took a 90% salary cut. And that's why she was so angry with Lyndon Johnson. And she says to him, how do you expect us to make ends meet, to pay our bills, this kind of thing. They were making in the 1950s $400,000 a year together. They drove twin Rolls Royces, etc. So because of that, Fortas, there were 2 problems Fortas had which led to his drive. First of all, this thing of extrajudicial political activity. Brandeis did it, so did Frankfurter. Nobody did it like Fortas. Fortas actually drafted Lyndon Johnson's State of the Union address in 1966. Fortas, there's a photo in my book of the National Security and State Department staff, a very big, important Vietnam policy making. The only person who shouldn't be in that photo was Abe Fortas. It was said of Fortas by everyone that he spent more time in the White House than he did in his Senate chambers. His law clerk said felt it was safe to take naps because he was never there. He was always at Lyndon Johnson's beck and call. Now and he advised him on a whole host of policies, which you're not supposed to do while you're on the court. Now, by the way, he was very good on Israel. One of his closest friends was Avram Harman, the Israeli ambassador to the United States at the time. And that too, and that was one good thing he did. But because his wife kept nudging him that we need more money. So he started taking outside honoraria that the justices were not supposed to take, including one. It started out with Louis Wolfson, who was a Jewish financier and had a foundation. And it started out by his giving money to one of the law schools in Washington for Fortas to give a series of lectures. That series of lectures was close to what his Supreme Court salary would have been, doubling that. And then it turns out that Wolfson is indicted. Now, Fortas becomes his private attorney, which he also shouldn't be doing while on the Supreme Court. And then Wolfson is indicted for fraud and corruption. It's on the front pages. And there's a whole thing about the financier and the justice. And this was all because of the money situation. He kept taking outside, consulting things only because his wife kept pushing him. And they were making a salary that most people would have been more than comfortable with. And so it finally caught up with him. And Lyndon Johnson makes the mistake of nominating Fortas. And here the irony is, Goldberg finally succumbed to Johnson's pressures because he thought that he could negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. Fortas is one of the super hawks amongst Johnson. He's pushing Johnson to continue the Vietnam War. And Johnson had implied and even promised Goldberg that he would succeed if he would bring him back as Chief Justice. When Warren retires, he nominates Fortas as Chief Justice. Then the scandal hits the fan, all of it. It's in the newspapers about the Wolfson Foundation, about how much money that Fortas has taken. He finally has to withdraw his name, and the scandal becomes so much that he resigns from the court.
Yes.
And it's sad because he was also brilliant. And Lyndon Johnson actually destroyed the careers of two people. And most of the biographers about Johnson say that. It's not a particularly sadly harsh thing to say. Of Arthur Goldberg, who would have had the most distinguished career on the court, and of Abe Fortas, who would have been much happier. And his wife would have been, making his, millions of dollars. And by the way, one cute story about Fortas. Fortas was a amateur violinist. But a great violinist from his childhood on, and that's what he loved. Outside of the law, his great love was, in fact, there's a story that he was always chauffeured all over Washington in his Rolls Royce. While his chauffeur chauffeured him, he would be in the back seat playing the violin.
So that brings us to the present. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What do you want to tell us about her?
Wonderful story. Okay. First of all, grows up in Brooklyn, Madison High School. Madison High School produced 3 Jewish senators, Bernie Sanders, Chuck Schumer, and what's his name, Norm Coleman. But it was one of the great high schools in Brooklyn. Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not face the discrimination as a Jew. She had many obstacles as a woman in the legal profession, but not as a Jew. She goes to Cornell University, where she meets her husband, Martin, and then they both go to Harvard Law School. He was 1 year ahead of her. They got married. Robert Gordis officiated, a very prominent Danny Gordis's grandfather, officiated at their wedding. She grew up in a Jewish home that kept kosher, etc. She is at the top of her class. She's the editor of the Law Review. But when her husband got a very good job with a big law firm in New York, so she follows her husband, completes her last year at Columbia Law School, has the distinction, I think, of being the only person, not only the only woman, ever to be on the law reviews of two law schools, Harvard and Harvard and Columbia, excuse me. She gets out, though. I told the story about Frankfurter. She should have gotten a Supreme Court clerkship. She got a clerkship with a minor federal judge in New York. Then in the 1960s, she starts an academic career, first at Rutgers, and then eventually at Columbia Law School. At Columbia, she becomes the first tenured woman law professor at Columbia. When she started at Rutgers, there were only 20 women on law school faculties in the country, throughout the country. And she develops in the 1970s, through working with the ACLU, the field of gender discrimination. And in fact, when Bill Clinton appoints her to the court, he says that she's done for gender discrimination what Thurgood Marshall did for race discrimination by race. She became the great spokesman. She argued several cases before the Supreme Court and she started teaching the first course at Columbia University ever on gender discrimination. And she becomes, that makes her reputation. Mm-hmm. But she's becomes a very renowned legal scholar. And by the way, when she's a professor there, it's the first time, which we'll talk about, she meets another professor who's at the University of Chicago, Antonin Scalia, who they become close friends, which I'll tell you.
Even though they're ideologically different.
And I'd like to talk about, in fact, while I'm talking about her, I'll talk about that in a minute. And she goes, then she's appointed by Jimmy Carter to the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals, and then by Bill Clinton to the Supreme Court. Bill Clinton has 2 Supreme Court appointments. He appoints Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and a year later, Stephen Breyer. But let me just tell that story about
both Jews.
Both Jews. His only 2 Supreme Court appointments. What's fascinating about the friendship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, yes. They are, for over 30 years, they and their spouses spend every New Year's Eve together. They go on vacation together. I have a photo, part of their friendship, and it amazes people, it amazes her liberal supporters and his liberal critics, that how could you be so close friends? You differ on everything. One of the things that bring them together is their shared love of opera. And they went to opera together for years and years. I have a photo in my book in their 18th century opera garb. They're extras at an opera production of one of Richard Strauss's operas in the Washington, D.C. National Opera. They love opera. They also had much in common from the years as law school professors. And it's a genuine friendship when there was, when Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, dies in 2010, there's a memorial service at the Supreme Court, and Antonin Scalia breaks down in tears. They were such close friends. And we know now, when Justice Scalia died also last year, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in tears. It surprised many, but I think it's such an admirable thing. When you think today, she was always a voice for civility on the court and affability on the court. When you think today of the, what's the word? Not only the dysfunction, but the politicization of the court and the divisions, this is so admirable that they could transcend. They were ideologically completely opposed to each other on basically every issue, and yet their
they
friendship
could still be friends.
and their and
It's
their friendship.
not typical today.
No, it's not typical today. It's not typical today at all, and it amazed so many people in an era of polarization and dysfunctional that they could still be genuine friends.
Yeah.
And it should be
a model.
I was just going to use the same word. It's a model, and it should continue to be a model, God willing, in the future.
Has Ruth Bader Ginsburg done anything judicial on the court that will be lasting?
Well, yes, especially in the field of gender, gender discrimination, on cases relating to that. Also, the famous case in which corporations are considered as people. She felt that that was one of the most disastrous cases in modern Supreme Court history, and still does. Now, one of her early famous cases was the Virginia Military Academy, which was a very prestigious military school, would not accept women or girls, as they would say, as students. And she wrote the decision that made that unconstitutional, and that opened the doors in several other cases for universities or schools that would discriminate against women.
She has been a real liberal voice on
She's
the court.
been probably the most continuously liberal voice. And also, she's become an icon, which
That's
is
correct.
She's become a kind of an icon for young people, and there's a whole cottage industry of T-shirts, of coffee mugs, of everything else with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's picture on them. And she's been interviewed. She said it would have amazed. She never imagined that she would become. Her celebrity transcends her being what she's done in judicial opinions.
It's interesting. Now, right after she is appointed,
Yes.
lo and behold, we get Stephen Breyer.
Okay, Stephen Breyer is also, like her, does not face discrimination in his ascent to the Supreme Court. He grows up in a Reformed Jewish family. He's bar mitzvahed. It's in San Francisco. He goes, I have a photo in his high school yearbook. He's voted the most likely to succeed, and he's the star debater. And one of the people he debates against in inter-city debates is Jerry Brown, who's in one of the Catholic high schools. He goes to Stanford University, Phi Beta Kappa, top of his class. He goes to Oxford University. There he meets his wife, Joanna. Now, Joanna it's fascinating, besides not being Jewish, Joanna is the daughter of Lord Blenkingham, part of the British aristocracy, who had been the chairman of the Conservative Party in England for years. He was in Harold Macmillan's cabinet. And he, by the way, Steve Breyer has the distinction of being the only Supreme Court justice, I think, in American history to marry into the British aristocracy. Their wedding, which I talk about, it was, of course, an intermarriage, but they took out any references to, it was in a small church in outside London, and they took out any Christological references from the ceremony. He comes back, and he works first in the Justice Department, then he starts working teaching at Harvard Law School, which he did in one form or another till his appointment to the Supreme Court. During the 1970s, he commutes to Washington first. He's one of the top people on with Archibald Cox on the Watergate Committee. Then he becomes the chief counsel for the Senate Judiciary Committee. And this is the great time of his life. He's always been known for his affability. You can't not like Steve Breyer whether you agree with him or not. And he works with the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time is Ted Kennedy, and his counterpart amongst the Republicans is Orrin Hatch. That's, by the way, an example of another friendship that transcended politics. So he is able to work very closely as the chief counsel of the Judiciary Committee and gains the admiration and respect of both Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch. So when he's nominated by Jimmy Carter also to the federal bench in 1980, you have Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch promoting his nomination, and 14 years later, the same thing. And if you could have Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch together promoting your nomination, it was a shoo-in. He's brilliant. He's the first justice since Cardozo, really, to write major works of legal scholarship while sitting on the court, which is fascinating. Some of his decisions, he takes more moderate positions in some cases. In fact, he votes at one point for religious symbols, in the public square, of enabling which most, church-state separationists don't. He's kind of a moderate liberal, more so, in that case, more so than Ruth Bader Ginsburg. By the way, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has now surpassed the tenure on the court of both Frankfurter and Brandeis. She's in her 24th year on the court, and Breyer will soon be. Now, what's interesting about Breyer's Jewishness, he's usually considered the most secular Jew on the court. He's one of his daughters is an Episcopal priest, but he's been a much more of a voice since on the court, a Jewish voice, than he had ever been before.
In what way?
Well, he's first of all accepted invitations to speak at one Jewish organization, and he's had a tremendous interest in the history of Zionism, which he's often spoken about. He's spoken at JTS, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, at the Conference of Presidents of American Jewish Organizations, at many synagogues. Often he's talked about the role of Brandeis and Frankfurter in the Zionist movement. And one of his talks, which was given at the Conference of Presidents, was then published in the New Republic, back when it was still the New Republic, in 1998, which is an immensely insightful, but also as a Jewish voice. For someone who is not, he belongs to a synagogue. I don't think he attends much. I shouldn't say that. But in 2003, when Yom Kippur was coming, the court for 30 years had always opened its sessions on, I always forget, is it the first Monday after the second Tuesday, or whatever it was that day, it was Yom Kippur. And Breyer, as Ginsburg, were going to be in shul, in synagogue, so they wrote to their fellow justice asking if it could be postponed one day. And in that sense, for someone who's considered, he does go to services on Yom Kippur and on Rosh Hashanah.
So now we come to Elena Kagan.
Okay, Elena Kagan, very fascinating. She also, by the way, she and Breyer grew up in comfortable middle-class families. Breyer's father was a very successful attorney in San Francisco. He was the attorney for the San Francisco School Board. Ginsburg grew up in a very poor family. All of the other justices had, except Brandeis. Elena Kagan grew up in an upper middle-class family, living on the Upper West Side. Her father was a Yale-educated attorney. She was a prodigy from the word go, and just precocious. The story I tell, which is before getting to her court years, her parents, when she was growing up, belonged to the Lincoln Square Synagogue, where Shlomo Riskin had just been starting out. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. She was a star Hebrew student. In 1972, she went to Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, to say she'd like to be a bat mitzvah. And Riskin had to explain to her that, the Orthodox community hasn't gotten there yet. He had never officiated at a bat mitzvah. She persisted, and I'm going to say later on, she broke glass ceilings for Jews and Jewish women. This was the first glass ceiling. She basically nudged him enough that he finally said, okay, and they had the first bar mitzvah he ever he ever bat mitzvah, bat mitzvah. And they remained in touch whenever apparently she's had one appointment or one thing. He sent her always a note or a letter, and when she's visited Israel, they've gotten together or spoken. And so that was
a lovely story.
It is a lovely story. So she goes to Princeton. She did brilliantly at Princeton, then gets a Marshall Scholarship, the same thing that Stephen Breyer got, goes to Oxford for a year, then comes back to Harvard Law School. And her father was very disappointed. He wanted her to go to Yale, but she decided she went to Harvard. After Harvard Law School, she had a Supreme Court clerkship with Thurgood Marshall. She then practices law for 2 years in the law firm in Washington, Williams and Connolly. But this is very important. She never gets to court. She never actually argues a case on her own. She's, a new associate. From there, she had also clerked as well for Abner Mikva. So then Abner Mikva becomes Bill Clinton's White House counsel. He brings her to the White House, and she works on the Domestic Policy Council in the Clinton administration as a legal advisor, but also primarily on the Domestic Policy Council. And she's actually nominated for a federal judgeship, but the Senate convened before it was one of the last midnight appointments before her nomination could be confirmed. I should have said, in between, after that law firm, she taught at the University of Chicago. And that's where she met another young instructor who was a state senator by the name of Barack Obama, and they both were research assistants to Laurence Tribe, who's the famous constitutional law professor at Harvard. And they were both, you've heard of Laurence Tribe, I guess, yeah.
Of course.
My father bar mitzvahed him. He grew up in San Francisco. And I'll say that during when Dukakis was ahead in the polls for the few weeks in 1988, I called my father and said, well, your first bar mitzvah may be on the court. You may have your first bar mitzvah on the court. But anyway, they both clerked, and that was, and Laurence, if you were his assistant, research assistant, that was going places. But then she renewed her, she established a friendship with Barack Obama. She goes from there to Abner Mikva to the White House. And then she, after the Clinton administration, she teaches first at Chicago for a short while and then goes to Harvard. In 2003, a lot of her career was shaped by the connections she made in the Clinton years in Washington. She had become a good friend of a future Secretary of the Treasury by the name of Larry Summers, who then is appointed the first Jewish president of Harvard. Summers appoints her the first woman dean of Harvard Law School in 2003, and obviously the first Jewish woman dean. And she does tremendously. She's a quintessential liberal, but she pleased everybody. She recruited both liberals and well-known conservatives to Harvard Law School, which was kind of interesting. And she was very popular amongst both liberals and conservatives alike, which Obama was elected. They had still remained in contact from the University of Chicago days, and she becomes the first woman Solicitor General. The fourth Jewish Solicitor General in history, but the first woman. And now what makes this interesting, the Solicitor General, of course it's sometimes called the 10th Justice, it's the government's lawyer who argues cases before the Supreme Court. Now keep in mind, she had never argued a case in any court. She had been 2 years at a law firm where she was a researcher, basically. Then she went into academia and worked on the White House staff. So she's all of a sudden the person who argues the cases before the Supreme Court, and held herself well, did well. So in 2010, she's then nominated by President Obama to the Supreme Court. Now, what I didn't mention before, the lack of a Protestant justice. When Louis Brandeis was appointed, it would have been unimaginable. Two things would have been unimaginable. Number one, that there would be a court with 3 Jewish justices simultaneously. And number two, that there would be a court without a Protestant justice. Until Justice Scalia's death last year, the Supreme Court had six Catholic justices and 6 Jewish justices. A Catholic seat on the court had evolved after a Jewish seat. But all of a sudden, with the retirement of Justice John Paul Stevens, the first time now, once again, he was the lone Protestant on the court. Now, for the last 7 years, when her appointment, there was the first time in modern history that there hadn't been a Protestant. Neil Gorsuch is an Episcopalian, so they returned that.
Was there pressure on President Obama to appoint a Protestant and not a Jew?
No, not that I know of, at least. And it was interesting. He admired Elena Kagan greatly. No, it wasn't. And I think there would have been pressure even if Hillary Clinton had won this year, rather to appoint a Protestant.
Interesting.
Because it was, it was conspicuous, by its absence, by the absence. But she's been now, also it's interesting, she was appointed at the age of 49, a few months before her 50th birthday, almost to a month apart to Neil Gorsuch's. This is the ideal age because, God willing, if a justice has good health, Elena Kagan can be on the court for 30 years. She's only in her 50s now. And by the way, a great friendship between, I should mention too, she also had an unusual friendship with Scalia, with Justice Scalia, which also says something about him. We only talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She, in fact, it'll surprise many people, went hunting with Justice Scalia on one of his hunting trips, which I don't think most people would relate to Elena Kagan.
Is there any decision she's been part of that in some way distinguishes her career or her judicial outlook, philosophy?
There was one interesting church-state case in which it had to do with about clergy speaking at, in this case, it was state legislative sessions. And she went back, in her opinion, I discussed it there, going back to the time of George Washington when he spoke at the Newport Synagogue, talking about how it had been a tradition that rabbis, not only that presidents had spoken at synagogues, but rabbis and other clergy had spoken at different government functions, opening up the Congress, etc.
I understand.
Yeah.
So as we begin to wrap up, first of all, if I said to you, I'm going to give you all the names. Not what do you think. You're not a lawyer. You're not you've never been a Supreme Court justice. From your understanding of how the legal world views and how history views these justices, I want you to rate them A, B, C, D. So, Louis Brandeis.
A, top the most.
Benjamin Cardozo.
Because of his short tenure, if you were to say his overall judicial career would be an A, but his short tenure on the court, a B or C.
Felix Frankfurter.
A B or C.
Arthur Goldberg.
Sadly, tragically, a B. A B or C.
He could have been.
He would have been like Brandeis had he stayed on the court.
I'm going to give them both A's then. Abe Fortas.
Okay, he deserves an A.
He deserves an A. Abe Fortas.
A B at best.
A B at best. Now, it's somewhat unfair to rank the sitting justices because their careers are not over. But if you think you heard some, we're overhearing somebody in the other room, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Her conservative critics would not agree, but I would give her an A.
Stephen Breyer.
I would give him an A too, actually.
Elena Kagan.
I think it's too close to call, but she has the potential to be an A.
We did pretty well there.
Yeah.
And it looks to me like,
And by the way, Cardozo, I want to give a little bit a plug for him because if you take his overall judicial career, his years as chief judge of the New York
Before he becomes judge.
Then he's an A. I mean,
Yes.
that probably is greater than his years on the court.
Well said. And it looks to me like Kagan, Ginsburg, Goldberg, and Cardozo have a strong Jewish background.
Yes.
Or identity,
At least identity.
Identity. All of them have something.
Yeah.
It looks to me like Fortas may be the least connected to the
I
Jewish.
would say the least. By the way, Breyer, I mentioned in the book, has talked about, as Ginsburg, about how is Jewish what it means to him being Jewish.
Yes.
And he's talked about it in very positive terms.
Yes.
And from his parents, what it meant to them,
Yes, but still, Breyer,
Yeah.
Fortas, Frankfurter, and Brandeis is the wild card here.
Yes.
Because although he grew up a very assimilated Jew, he represented and took so many important Jewish stands.
And in the Zionist movement, he has to be,
Yes, I mean, he's the...
Yeah, and by the way, I should recount one other thing. In his later years, one of his daughters married, who there's a story there too, married to a law school classmate who grew up in a conservative Jewish home, a conservative synagogue. And when he has grandchildren, and this daughter and the grandchildren, they celebrated all the Jewish. For the first time in his life, he sends Hanukkah cards. He sends Rosh Hashanah cards. He calls to wish them, I don't think he said Chag Sameach, but, call them for the holidays,
There
et
is
cetera.
an arc to Jewish life sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes it looks like it may be over, but it isn't.
Yeah.
This is a very important lesson, by the way, having another with the Supreme Court, having to do with the fact that grandparents, parents, children, you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And if you're Jewish, you stay open to it all
Yeah.
and you embrace all. Yes?
Exactly. Yes, completely.
What's it mean, do you think, that now, today, as you and I are sitting at this table, there are 3 Supreme Court justices who are Jewish on the Supreme Court of the United States, when Louis Brandeis and Benjamin Cardoza and Felix Frankfurter and even Arthur Goldberg couldn't get a job sometimes because they're Jewish.
Okay.
What's it say that we have 3 today?
It says a lot, which I think is one of the themes of my book, really, is about the decline of anti-Semitism in the American legal profession. That first of all, you could have 3 Jewish justices simultaneously, but also that each of these 3 Jewish justices did not confront anti-Semitism in their road up in the legal profession. They didn't confront the obstacles that the previous justice, Brandeis accepted, did. And in other words, today, also, I didn't mention, I could tell a lot about law school professors. When Brandeis wanted, Brandeis and Frankfurter tried to lobby to help bring more Jewish professors at the great law schools. This has changed tremendously. By the 1980s, the deans of Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Northwestern law schools were all Jewish. The law school faculty, the Jews on the law school faculties of most universities today are at least 40 to 50%, if not more.
It's amazing.
And if you names of famous, that even people who are not lawyers, people like Alan Dershowitz, Larry Tribe, others, and so many others, some of the most prominent legal scholars and lawyers in the country are Jewish.
I want to tell you a story myself. My grandfather, who was from the Slobodki Yeshiva,
Also, yeah.
came to America, and like so many of his generation, he stayed Orthodox, but he did not remain a rabbi. He went into business. He was very successful in the Midwest, in Ohio, and he was in a little town called Union City. And at one point, they said to him, Ben, his name was Ben Newman, Ben, we'd like you to be mayor.
Oh, wow.
And Ben Newman said, I will not be mayor of Union City, because if something ever goes wrong,
Yes.
they won't say it's the mayor.
Yes.
They'll say it's the Jew.
Yes.
What's interesting to me is
Yes.
Alan Dershowitz, when he graduates Harvard,
Yeah.
he's discriminated against
Right.
at law schools.
At law schools. And by the way, when Henry Kissinger, many Jews were very concerned when Kissinger became Secretary of State, depending how Vietnam would go, it would be blamed on Kissinger, the
right.
Jew.
What's interesting to me, and I think our audience should understand this as well, nobody ever mentions in a negative way
That's right.
the Jewish identity of Ginsburg, Breyer, and Kagan.
Exactly.
We have transcended that.
We've transcended. Not only that, but their Jewishness, their religion is not mentioned at all in their hearings.
Exactly right.
At all.
It's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant completely. That's what I mean.
And that is a testament to where America has grown to.
I agree 1,000%. In fact, that's one of the themes of my book. And also even Merrick Garland, who people didn't know, but the religion was not mentioned at all. And even when Bill Clinton makes his only 2 Supreme Court appointments, Jews, that's not, it's
Nobody says a word.
It's
Exactly.
irrelevant completely.
Exactly.
And it's a wonderful place to which we've come, that this is no longer an issue. It's no longer.
David, you are marvelous.
Oh, thank you so much.
This was such an education for us. It was exciting. You have written a superb book. Again, it's a very easy read. It's a joy to read. Thank you for giving me so much time. I hope you and I will have many opportunities to be together.
I hope so too.
It was a joy.
And thank you so much for inviting me. And if I can say, I've been such a fan of not only L'chaim, the interview, but of JBS, and I'm honored to be here with you today.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. David Dalin, whose superb book is entitled Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, From Brandeis to Kagan, Their Lives and Their Legacies. It's published by Brandeis Press, and of course it's available in Jewish bookstores everywhere and on Amazon. I recommend this book highly if you like history and you like American Jewish history. This book should be a part of your library. It's a wonderful gift to anybody you know who cares and is interested in Jewish life and Jewish history. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas you've heard on these editions of L'chaim with David. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And if you want to be in touch with David Dalin, you can do so by writing to me, and I will pass it on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.